Professor Marcia Langton says the best times of her childhood were spent lying under the night sky, looking up at the Milky Way. She says that later she took her own kids out camping, far from city lights, to have that same experience under the stars. For Aboriginal people, like other First Nations people, the night sky isn't simply a thing of beauty. There is a great body of Indigenous knowledge about the stars, planets and activities of the sky. Marcia Langton points this out in her introduction to The First Astronomers. This book is an account of the science of Indigenous star knowledge, put together by Duane Hamacher under the guidance of Indigenous Elders. Duane is an astronomer and astrophysicist based at the University of Melbourne. Hi, Duane.
Hi.
Now, why is it that I'm talking to a guy called Duane with the accent that you've got about Indigenous astronomy?
That's a really good question. It was never planned out to be this way. I grew up in the US and fell in love with all things Australian when I was a kid. And when I found myself in my early 20s, I had the opportunity to come to Australia for the first time and spend a few months, spend a semester as a student. And I fell in love with it. And I moved back a couple of years later, and I've been here ever since. But I didn't come to Australia with the idea of studying this area at all. I came to actually study exoplanets, planets orbiting distant stars. But the gravity of my interest in this field, based on a couple of experiences that I had when I came to Australia, really set me on this pathway.
And why you, Duane, and not one of the elders that you worked with? How have you ended up as a spokesman, I guess?
Well, this has been my academic job for a number of years, and I've worked for and with a lot of different communities across Australia and around the world. A lot of the elders have written books on stuff, not necessarily about the stars in Australia. That might be part of it. But there have certainly been elders who've written lots of stuff before. But this was an opportunity to focus on the science of the knowledge. And when I worked with the elders in the communities, they were quite adamant that they wanted the knowledge to be turned into something educational for their community students and for the world, because they wanted people around the globe to understand that, as they say, they're people of culture and a people of science. And writing a book is no easy feat. It takes a long time, a lot of hard work, and a lot of effort. So it was my responsibility to help do that and help facilitate that. And this has been a book almost 5 years in the making, based on, in reality, close to 14 years of research and work. And this is my full-time job, and it still took me that long.
You've worked particularly closely with 6 elders who've approved of the material that you've included in The First Astronomers. How much of what they know did they share with you, do you think?
Oh, the tiniest amount. They're very open about that. The elders will say that, what they've shared with me is the kindergarten levels of knowledge. But even, as I say in the book, that's a lot to take in. There's a tremendous degree of science we can see embedded within those levels of knowledge, even at the lower end of the spectrum. There have been times that the elders have shared some upper levels of knowledge. I've included some of that at their request, and some of it I haven't. But it's usually a longer process. It takes years and years to, be privy to that degree of knowledge. And even then, there's strict protocols around what can be shared and who can hear it and who can know about it. And over the years, there have been times where the elders have told me some of the upper levels of knowledge, which has just completely blown me away. And even that for them is sort of like, that's kind of the high school level stuff you get to learn about now. But with the elders, and especially in the Torres Strait, they're a little bit more pragmatic with it. And they talk to me about really the science of that knowledge as well, not just, the broader scope of knowledge, because they know that's what I'm looking at and what I'm interested in helping to share with the world.
When did you first travel to the Torres Strait?
I think that was 2014, if my memory serves me. I keep thinking 2013. I'm pretty sure it was 2014. And I had been to northern Queensland numerous times, but never up to the Torres Strait. And I went with Professor Martin Nakata. So Martin Nakata is a Torres Strait Islander, world-renowned scholar, and the first Torres Strait Islander to earn a PhD in Australia. And he wrote this phenomenal foundational book called Disciplining the Savages, Savaging the Disciplines. And it was really about this theoretical framework he developed called the cultural interface. And part of that is looking at the interface of Western and Indigenous ways of knowing to find a middle ground. It's far more complex than that, but we went up and he took me to Wyman or Thursday Island, where he had grown up. And we stayed with his mother there. And, it was my first time seeing that. And even a lot of the islanders, the communities on those islands in the southwest, Ghillar, actually consider themselves to be Aboriginal. It's sort of like the quote unquote real Torres Strait Islands. That's sort of the northern and easterly and central islands. And, it was quite an eye-opening experience because it was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. But Thursday Island, when you're there, it's like a town. It was when I first went to the other islands that I really got to see things in quite a different light.
Tell me about the island Mare or Murray Island. What does it look like in the daytime?
Well, that was the first island, in the Torres Strait proper, I think, as you might say. It's a beautiful island. It's only a few square kilometers in size. There's two little islands or islets, you might say, off the coast towards the southwest, Dawar and Wair. And they're volcanic islands. They're right at the very tip of the Great Barrier Reef. And being volcanic means they're very lush. Dense forests, beautiful mountain peaks. It's got the full range of geography on it, it seems. And the population is only about 450 people. It's a very tight community. And people actually lived on Dawar and Wair until about, I think, 50 years ago or so, when they were sort of relocated to the main island of Mare. But it's really a powerful place. It is remote compared to the other Torres Strait Islands, which are sort of clumped into groups. I just can't quite describe the beauty of it. For me in particular, I absolutely love sunsets. In fact, my place where I live in Melbourne, even though it's west facing, it's an inferno on summer evenings like we've had lately. I get the most stunning sunsets from there, and I love it. And watching the sunset from up there, especially as it goes behind Dawar, puts those islands in silhouette. It's absolutely gobsmacking how beautiful it is.
What were you told about sharks and the night sky on your first visit up to the Torres Strait?
When Professor Nakata and I were sitting outside the balcony of his mother's place on Wyman on Thursday Island, we were just chatting. It was evening. We'd just eaten. And we were just having a chat, and the sun had gone down, and the stars had come out. And it was a clear night. And of course, I recognized a particular group of stars. For me, in the Northern Hemisphere, I recognized them as the Big Dipper, part of the constellation Ursa Major. For us, like in the U.S., the Big Dipper is like your Southern Cross. Like, it's the one everybody knows, everybody relates to. But for me, it was upside down, right? Because we're looking at it from the Southern Hemisphere. And I had remembered reading that constellation was called Bosun, the shark. And that when the nose of Bosun touches the horizon, which happens in around about June during the dry season, that signified that the sharks were breeding and they were coming really close to the shoreline. Now, I had read that in words, that's a different experience than actually seeing it. And I remember standing outside with Professor Nakata, and I pointed and I actually repeated what I just said to you. I said, "Is that right? That's what I've read." And he says, "Oh, wait till tomorrow." And then we flew over to Mare. And again, the island's not very big. We just walked down to the lodge. We dropped our gear off, and then we walked down to the beach. And the water was amazing. There were these 3-meter sharks just jetting back and forth in water that didn't even feel like it came above my ankle. I mean, half the shark was sticking out of the water. And they were sort of darting back and forth really close to the shoreline. And they were feeding on toot, the sardines. So it's one thing to see it written down. It's another thing altogether to experience it and see it with your own eyes.
And when you remarked about the dangers of swimming in that kind of water, what did he say to you?
It was a bit of a cheeky sense of humor. We have that rapport with each other. And as we were flying in, the plane's small. It's like, 8-passenger planes, like a minivan with wings, really. And as we were flying in, I saw a bunch of kids down by the dock, and they were swimming in the water. And I remember thinking, well, hang on a second. Here's these sharks, darting back and forth in this water. Hang on, I saw the kids swimming. Aren't they worried about getting bitten? And he says, "No, we train them only to bite white fellas." I was literally taking a drink of water when he said, I almost spit it out and sort of laughed. Got a good chuckle over that one. But that's one of the things, even going beyond that. Not only were the kids not worried about that, but there were times where I'd been out walking along the shore and the kids recognized me because it's a small island, and I would speak to the students in the school. And they'd come down and they'd recognize me. I'd be like, "Oh, Dr. Duane, Dr. Duane." And I look around and the kids are actually feeding the sharks. And while one is feeding, another one goes up and grabs it by the tail. And they're like playing with it, like kids do with dogs. And they go up and they pull the dog's tail or whatever. And I'm looking around, there's no parent to be seen. These are kids like, 7, 8, 9 years old. They're playing with the sharks. And I'm thinking, it's not unusual there. The kids grow up in this environment. They know this stuff. And the kids were telling me what to do if I'm in the water and the sharks come by like, "Oh, this is what you do and what you don't do." And they're giving me a full detailed lesson because they grow up in this environment. They know this stuff. I don't.
What did you notice about the moon, Duane, on your first few trips up to the Torres Strait?
Well, I didn't pay much attention the first time we went. I did recognize the moon phases because I'm always checking that. And I noticed it was the second or the third trip that we'd gone up, and every single time it was always the same moon phase. And I remembered asking Professor Nakata, I said, "I kind of noticed the moon's always the same phase. Is there a reason for that?" And he's like, "Good, you're paying attention." And it was a first quarter moon. So it was evening. You just see the left half of the moon as it is, illuminated. And as is typical style, he sort of mentioned it had something to do with fishing, but didn't really go into any detail. It's one of those things where the elders often give you a piece of information and leave it up to you to try to figure out the rest. It's not just sit down and tell you everything you want to know. It's a learning process and a learning journey. And then when I finally managed to figure it out, and I asked him about that, he sort of shook his head and goes, "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." And it turned out to be more complicated than that, but that was a good starting point. It's the quarter moons are where you get the neap tides. It's where the high tides don't get too high and the low tides don't get too low. And what happens is because the tides aren't rushing in and rushing out very hard like they would at a new moon or a full moon, the water was much clearer. You could see the fish could see the bait. It was better. But then later on, one of the elders on Mare explained to me, Uncle William Barrow explained to me that, well, there's more to it, that when the low tide goes out, it takes all the fish with them because the water's fairly shallow up on the reef near the island. And they get taken out beyond the reefs for a long part of the day because the tides are really slow coming back. So the fish eat when they're near the reef, not out at sea. So when the high tide finally brings them back in, the fish are hungry. And that's referred to that as, in the traditional language, the translation is the hungry tide. That's the best time to go fishing. And the elders say, well, you want a couple of days either side of the quarter moon is the best time to go fishing. So if you start learning more about it and go a bit deeper, they start telling you more and more detail. It's not ever just one thing that seems simple. It's always more complex.
What do people in that part of the Torres Strait call someone who has really good knowledge of the stars?
In the Western Torres Strait, David Bosun, who's one of the contributing authors in the book, he's an artist, and his father was a traditional astronomer called a Zugabal Mabaig, and it literally translates to starman or star person. And he described this as someone who, when they're relatively young, they're taken from the family and put in the quad, which is a university or a parliament house, what we might think of as a university or parliament house. And they would go through 7 years of intense instruction to become a Zugaboma. And when they graduated, I guess you might say, they had a very broad knowledge of astronomy, but they also were protectors of certain stars and constellations. So if you can almost think about this synonymously with Western education system. You go into a university, and when you graduate, you go into a bachelor's degree, graduated a PhD in Australia, it takes 7 years or roundabout, and you have a very broad knowledge of astronomy, but you specialize in certain areas. And he says the Zugaboma will stay up at night and always keep track of where everything in the sky is. And he will inform the people about when to plant or harvest gardens and crops, when to fish, when to hunt, when to hold ceremony, anything that's related to that, when the best time to go out at sea, to navigate. All of that is informed by the Zugaboma.
Tell me a bit about your introduction to the night sky, Duane. How old were you when you first remember looking up in the night sky as a kid?
It's a really good question. I don't remember a specific day. Or a specific event. Like I knew people who, was seeing Halley's Comet or some other major event. Since I was as young as I can remember, I was always a really nerdy kid who became a really nerdy adult. And I was always obsessed with science, and in particular, astronomy was probably that, and dinosaurs were my two big loves. I think most kids have that. You ask most kids what areas of science they love, and it tends to be dinosaurs and stars. I loved rocks. I loved chemistry. I loved all that stuff. But I remember just being fascinated by astronomy. I was always the kid who was a bit of a dreamer. He was had his head in the clouds a bit. So I think it just suited my personality and my interests. And I grew up out in the country. I grew up surrounded by farmlands in mid-Missouri. So we had reasonably dark skies. At least I thought that's what we had until the first time I saw truly dark skies. That blew me away. But I was always the kind of kid who was a night owl, who was obsessed with the stars, and I would just sit outside and look up all the time.
What's the best view you've had of the sky here in Australia? Which night stands out in your mind?
Oh, the first time I really went out to the Central Desert. And I'd seen some beautiful dark skies in Australia before. When I came to Australia, I spent a lot of time at Siding Spring Observatory looking for planets around other stars. Gorgeous views of the stars up there. But the one that really sticks in my mind the most is when we were filming a National Geographic documentary for a Morgan Freeman series. And we were out in the middle of the desert near Norla. This is a mountain range out there, which is an ancient meteorite impact crater. And the Aranda traditions about how it formed are pretty much the same as the Western traditions. And we were camped out that night, the film crew and us, we were camped out in Swag. And what blew me away is this was August. So August and September is when the Milky Way is straight overhead. Now, the nearest town or city was Alice Springs. That's like 140 kilometers away. There was no light pollution. It was just coming out of what we think of as winter, so it was pretty chilly, but not freezing cold. It was clear. There wasn't any dust or any humidity or anything. The night sky was just stunning. And in the middle of the night, we were sleeping in Swag. I woke up and looked up, and I almost felt like I was going to fall into the Milky Way. It was almost like a case of vertigo. And I was blown away. I could see things with my eyes that you need a telescope to see in the city. And even then, you don't get a very good view.
So it was the stars, the sky, that brought you to Australia to study, where you were continuing your study in astrophysics first off. How did you move into a different kind of approach to the stars, or one that brought in the social sciences as well? What was that shift like for you personally?
When I was an undergrad working on my degree in physics at the University of Missouri, degrees in the U.S. are far more broad. So we do a lot of, for a physics degree, you would also do social sciences and humanities and things like that. And I became really interested in an area called archaeoastronomy, because I'd grown up loving geography and ancient history and all those kinds of things. I would sit around and read geographical maps in my spare time. I told you I was nerdy. Right? So the idea that I could somehow bring these worlds together was fascinating for me. And when I came to Australia, I was doing upper level, courses in astrophysics. But there was an experience that I had that really planted the seed for all of this. And it was 2003 in August. And I was here for a semester in Sydney. And Mars had reached its closest approach to the Earth in something like 60,000 years. So the observatory on campus was holding telescope viewing. So me and one of the other study abroad students, we went over there and we were checking it out. I remember asking somebody about Aboriginal views of the stars, because I knew absolutely nothing about Aboriginal anything. And the response I got, they just sort of dismissed it, and they made a really horrifically racist comment. And the other student and I just sort of looked at each other. We didn't say anything. Our eyes just connected, and we're like, what was that? And we just sort of smiled and backed away slowly, like, let's get out of here. It was really weird and really confronting. And that sort of mentality was quite on show. And when I asked a few other people over the next few months, I just kept getting this idea that Aboriginal people didn't know anything about astronomy. They didn't have science. That's ridiculous. They're just myths and legends. And I thought, well, this is weird. And when I came back to Australia and I was doing astrophysics, I just kept getting drawn to that debate, that question. And I thought, hang on. There's no way you're going to have people here for as long as people have been here and have all this detailed knowledge about the world around them and not know something about the stars. And when I started looking into that a little bit, I'm like, well, of course they know tons about the stars. And that was easy. I also recognized there was a tremendous amount of science there that just wasn't getting recognized. And that's when I made the shift. I said, well, this is something I want to do instead.
That phrase that you heard an academic use, that Aboriginal culture wasn't about science, or Aboriginal people traditionally didn't know about science. How do you define science, Duane?
Well, that's a really funny question, because I do guest lecturing in the history and philosophy of science courses over here. And for the first year students, when I ask that question, what is science? The academics and the postdocs and the grad students just sit back laughing, because there is no set definition for science. It's very complex. You can look at it in a more broad sense. It comes from scientia, which means knowledge. But at the fundamental level, it's about understanding the world around us, how it works through observation, experimentation, deduction, different types of logic, and how you can make sense of all that and how you can apply it that has some sort of predictive purpose. That's like the very simple definition that I use. But the main idea around this is there's not just one form of science. And what we think of as Western science, even different disciplines work in quite different ways with a general set of guiding principles. And what I really wanted to emphasize is that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous sciences and Western sciences are not the same thing, but there is a substantial crossover between the two, and that is the focus of the book.
I think that for some non-Indigenous people, traditional stories and legends are kind of dismissed as how people explained the natural world before science came along and revealed the truth of it. But as a scientist, how do you see the stories that First Nations people tell about the stars?
Well, they're definitely not what most people think of are myths and legends. What people think of, these songs, dances, the oral traditions, are a mnemonic system of orality. It's a medium through which you transmit knowledge. Most cultures in the world and most cultures throughout history did not have structured written languages. That's a relatively recent and relatively narrow thing in the breadth of human history. Humans have evolved to have the ability of memorizing tremendous amounts of information purely through memory, through systems of orality. We have brains that evolved to utilize the method of loci, or attaching a memory to place. Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine a few years ago went to somebody who worked out the mechanisms for that. That is one of the things that distinctly separates humans from the rest of the animal kingdom, is our ability for memory and song and the way that we utilize that. So what we think of as myths or legends, these narratives, these stories, are meant to take all the information that you know about something and hand that down orally. Well, you can't just memorize a list of facts. It's dry, boring, and people aren't very good at it. But you encapsulate that in a narrative, and the narrative is going to tell you about the way things behave, how things interact, how they interconnect. It's going to have information about seasons and the motions of stars and the behavior of plants and animals, but also about social lessons, laws, social structure. How are you supposed to live in the world? All of that is embedded together. And what people might think of as a story is something that is meant to embed and transmit this knowledge. It's not necessarily the knowledge itself. It's a way of transmitting that knowledge. So it's like asking, well, why don't scientists in textbooks? A textbook is a way that we transmit knowledge, or a book or a paper, whatever, because Western science and Western society loves the written word. Anything that's oral is considered hearsay. It doesn't really matter. That's sort of dismissed, which is one of the problems we have in this whole area. And that's why people don't think that orality is very effective. But it is remarkably effective. And we just have lost our ability to utilize that in today's society.
This is Conversations with Sarah Kanowski.
Duane, you were explaining that Aboriginal stories about the sky, which have sometimes been dismissed by outsiders as myths, in fact hold a lot of deep scientific knowledge. What are some of your favourite examples of that?
I usually, when I talk about this stuff, just give a very abridged version of the tradition, just so we can see the structure and then we can see the science behind it. Because they're not really my stories to tell in that sense. But there's two different traditions, oral traditions, as I prefer to refer to them, both from South Australia, one from the Great Victoria Desert and one from down near the Coorong. So the Kukatha people in the Great Victoria Desert near Ulia, South Australia, and many other cultures across the central and western deserts have similar traditions, talk about the stars of Orion, the Pleiades, and the Hyades being connected. And Nairu and Nairuna is the man represented by Orion. And curiously, they say that that constellation is basically the same as the Greek version. It's a man standing, he's got a belt and his arms and legs are there dominating. It's just that he's upside down in Australia. And they actually talk about him being upside down. But he's seen as this sort of, he's much like the Greek version of Orion. He's very proud. He's a very skilled warrior, very attractive, but he's also a bit of a coward, a bit of a braggart, and a bit of a womanizer. And he chases these young girls, these young sisters that represent the Pleiades. And he's always trying to pursue them, but they're too young for him. And their eldest sister knows that he's a bit of a coward, so she stands up to him. And she is the group of stars called the Hyades. The Hyades is this V-shaped cluster of stars between Orion and the Pleiades. In Greek traditions, that's the horns of Taurus the bull. And she stands before him and tries to draw attention to herself, and then she mocks and humiliates him. And he gets very angry because he can't get to the sister, so he builds up this fire magic in his right hand, which is the star Betelgeuse. And he tries to utilize that to get her out of the way, but she counters by creating this fire magic in her left foot, Aldebaran. And she kicks sand in his face, and it humiliates him, and the other stars all laugh, and his fire magic dies down again. So she puts a row of dingo puppies between him and herself. And putting a row of dingo puppies is a bit of a sign of humiliation. He's so weak and pathetic, she doesn't need to put dingo, she can just put puppies there and that'll keep him away. And in Greek traditions, these are the stars that represent his shield, or in some versions, his bow, And he gets angry again and he tries to come back with his fire magic. And then she calls on Baba, the father dingo, to come. And Baba, the father dingo, comes and grabs Nairuna and shakes him and starts, throwing him around in the sky, and his fire magic dies down again. So it's just this cycle of these stars getting brighter and fading over time. And what they're describing is the variability of these two stars, Betelgeuse and Aldebaran. because in terms of astrophysics, they're red giant stars that pulsate. And as they pulsate, they get brighter and they fade over time. Betelgeuse does this by about a full magnitude once every 400 days or so. It's not exact, it's approximate. So about every bit over a year, you can see Betelgeuse sort of get a bit brighter and then fade a bit. And Aldebaran does the same, but it doesn't do so at the same time scale. It's sort of random. It'll get a bit brighter and a bit fainter and then spend long periods of time doing nothing. So these traditions describing the variability of these stars are quite important because it was recorded, these stories, in the 1840s. And it was the 1840s when Western science finally figured out that these stars are variable. They didn't find out from the traditions, but they could have if they had not just dismissed them as myth and legend. The elders talk all the time about your ability to read the stars. They say there's a difference between reading the stars and seeing the stars. And reading the stars is how you can observe and interpret all of the changes in the positions and properties of the stars and what they mean. And you've got to realize people would spend a humongous amount of time observing every little tiny detail of the stars, how they twinkle, what color they are, how sharp are they, where are they in the sky, where are they in relation to the planets, the moon, the sun, what time are they visible. All of these things have importance. So it's not surprising they would pay close enough attention to notice that sometimes the stars are a bit brighter than the other stars around them, sometimes they're the same, and sometimes they're a bit fainter. And all this is passed down through these very complex and very rigorous systems of orality. So I think in the West, we tend to not think about that because we just focus on everything being written down. If we want to know something, we go to our phones. But we've completely lost we still have the ability, but we've lost our understanding of how to commit things to memory because we just don't have to. But indigenous cultures of the world still do that. Even the ancient Greeks did that. And even the ancient Greek philosophers were saying, if we keep focusing on what's written down, we're going to lose our power of orality. And that's exactly what's happened in the West today.
Duane, you mentioned twinkling there, which, of course, for the layperson is one of the most observable characteristics of stars, that they twinkle. We celebrate that in nursery rhymes, in poems. But from an astronomer's point of view, how do you feel about the fact that stars twinkle? What does that mean for your observations?
Oh, for astrophysicists, twinkling stars are the worst. In fact, the whole atmosphere is the problem. So, it's turbulence in the atmosphere that makes the stars twinkle. So astronomers, or astrophysicists, I should say, when we're using the telescopes to observe the stars, we want the best resolution images we can get because we're looking at very faint stars that are very far away. So humidity and turbulence and heat, all of these things can disrupt our ability to see those stars. So we put these observatories in the tops of mountains to put them as high above the atmosphere as we can to minimize those effects. We put them in space telescopes. The only reason we do that is to get them outside the Earth's atmosphere. As even talks about trying to put telescopes in the moon. But of course, for astrophysicists, that's a big problem. But for indigenous astronomers, twinkling stars aren't a problem. They're a tool.
What kind of tool?
Well, this is something a lot of elders have spoken about and something I didn't know much about it at all until about 2013, 2014. The idea is that you could use the twinkling stars to tell you something seemed foreign to me. And that's something we're just trying to get rid of and avoid, as an astrophysicist. But, for the indigenous elders and the astronomers, they tell you about atmospheric conditions because that's what causes the stars to twinkle, right? So if you look at the way the stars twinkle, how fast do they twinkle? Do they change color? Do they change anything about their visual properties? Any subtle, tiny little thing tells you about humidity, about turbulence and trade winds, tells you about air pressure, all these kinds of atmospheric phenomenon, which tells you about the local environment. It tells you about weather, climate, and seasons.
On Mare in the Torres Strait, what did you learn about twinkling stars and animal behaviour?
A lot. Uncle William Barrow was one of the elders who sat with me one day. We were up on the school near the top middle part of the island. and we got into a conversation about the twinkling stars. And they've got a song called Where in the Sky Straight Up. It's all in the Meriam language, which is the traditional language of the Eastern Torres Strait. And it talks about how the stars will twinkle later in the year. And even though the air on the ground is dead still, the stars will twinkle like embers in a fire. And they know that the seasons are going to be changing, that they're coming into the monsoon season, that the southeasterly winds are going to be changing to the northwesterly winds. So you look at this song and it's a text. It's a scientific lesson that's sung, because singing is one of the best ways that you can remember things. And it's a fairly modern song. It's not one of the traditional cob cars or old sacred songs. I think it was written in the 1960s by George Passi, who was a Meriam man and later an academic. And Uncle William was telling me he's expanding on that even more, saying not only do you look at the way the stars twinkle, but like everything, you can't look at one thing in particular. You don't just look at the stars or just the phase of the moon. You've got to look at your environment in total. And he says, well, one of the things you look for is the twinkling stars, but another thing you want to look for is a certain type of butterfly. And he says the female of the species is inside the bushes, but when the humidity goes up and the stars are twinkling and you can see the males are fluttering about, going a bit wild, they've got the same colors as he likened to the reggae flag, those sort of Jamaican reggae colors. And he said, when you see the males, those butterflies fluttering around, you see certain cockroaches out and about, you see the stars twinkling, you know a storm is coming. So, and those storms that come at the end part of the year, that signals the start of the monsoon, the cookie season. So it's never one thing. It's just part of your larger toolkit.
My sense of the constellations is a group of bright stars. But what are dark constellations?
Dark constellations, that's a term that I guess people in my field use to describe constellations that are traced out by the dark spaces between the stars. And those are predominantly in the Milky Way. So when you get a beautiful view of the Milky Way, you see all these light and dark spaces. And those dark spaces, or the silhouettes of the light spaces, can trace out a whole lot of different things. And there's one in particular that you find in cultures around the Southern Hemisphere. Well, there's more than that one, but there's a really sinuous part of the Milky Way between the Southern Cross and the False Cross. And for example, in Wiradjuri traditions, it's called Wawi, and it's a sort of sacred serpent. And the Milky Way is seen as a waterway, or Warrnambool is one of the many names for it. And you find that all across southeastern Australia, Warrnambool or Warrnambool being a river, and the Milky Way. And if you go to Quechua traditions in South America, that same sinuous dark nebula is also a snake, and the Milky Way is also seen as a waterway. They're very similar.
What about the emu that a lot of Aboriginal groups identify as a dark constellation in the sky? Where does that exist, and how is that read?
Well, the emu is probably one of the most widespread ones, and I've been fortunate to have elders across the country tell me their different views of the emu. And this is a dark constellation traced out. It's a perfect silhouette of an emu, and once you see it, you'll never not see it. The head is at the Coalsack Nebula, right near the Southern Cross, and its head and neck and body are traced out. It goes into Scorpius and Sagittarius into the middle of the Milky Way. And when this emu, depending on where in the sky it is, either dusk or dawn, so just after the sun's gone down or just before it comes up, tells you about the seasons, about the behavior of the emu, all these different things. Now, the stories about how it got into the sky or why it's there are going to vary. The names are going to vary between each of the different languages and cultures. But at the foundational level, its meaning and what it tells you tends to always be the same or very, very similar, because the behavior of the emu is mostly the same across the country. And what's remarkable about that one is it's not even the only kind of large flightless bird, that same part of the sky in Australia. You find that also in South America with the rhea. The Inca had the llama, very similar kind of shape in the sky. Obviously, a llama is not a bird, but it's still that same sort of silhouette. The Rhea in South America is almost exactly the same. And again, the traditions about why it's there and how it got there are going to be different, but its meaning are virtually the same.
And what meaning in particular gets read there around rainfall, around weather forecasting?
It's going to vary depending on the region, but Uncle Ghillar Michael Anderson, who's the first listed elder, who's also a co-author on the book, he talks about how in about October and November, the position of the emu is very low in the horizon. And he sort of sees it, or he describes it as being seen as the emu sitting in a water hole. And as the emu sits in the water hole, it displaces the water, which falls as rains. Now, the reason it's sitting in a water hole is because the temperature jumps up, but so does the rainfall that time of the year. And if you look, like at Lightning Ridge, for example, in northern New South Wales, if you look at the rainfall spread throughout the year, you see this massive peak in October and November, and then it drops down really low over the rest of what we think of as the summertime. So again, it's sort of like a celestial Archimedes. Archimedes is famous for getting his bathtub and seeing the water displaced and running naked through the street shouting Eureka. He figured out a problem that he'd been trying to work on. And similar kind of thing with the emu. The emu sits in the water holes, which displaces the water, which the celestial version is seen as falling out of the sky as that seasonal rain.
Stars are, of course, used for navigation in many cultures around the world. How are star maps of the sky aligned with song lines down below on land? How does that work?
Every elder that I've ever learned from, every elder who's an author in the book, and there were a lot more elders than just those 6, by the way. The reason I had to pick 6 is because of the trade book industry. I couldn't put all 85 down that I wanted to. And they said that if you're going to have authors, you can only have 7 on a trade book. So I had to pick 6 elders, and those were the 6 elders who we'd learned the most from, I'd learned the most from, and who'd also published academic research. But all of them say that everything in the sky is a reflection of what's on the land and vice versa. As is above, so is below. So what that means is the sky serves as a scientific textbook, as a law book, as a map, and as a memory space. So if you're going to, travel long distances across the land or the sea, you have to develop ways of memorizing that and teaching that. And the stars are a really good example of that. You travel, let's say, 600 kilometers to go to a ceremony. You got to find the best pathway. Where's the food? Where's the water? Where are you going to camp for the night? Where's the medicine? You got to figure all these things out. And you got to be able to teach that to other people. How do you do that? We utilize the stars. So you can map these things out in the stars to teach them. And these stars can serve as like waypoints on a journey. And you find that all around Australia and all around the world.
You were out doing some work for an Aboriginal-owned tourism company when something lit up the night sky. What did you see?
Yeah, that was up in Kakadu. And I was there with my partner at the time, who was also an astrophysicist. And we were setting up a tour program for a tour company there. And they normally would do tours during the day on the billabongs to see crocs, because that's what the tourists want to see. The punters wanted to see the crocs. So they wanted to do something at night that was focused on the stars. So we developed this tour program, and most all of the tour guides were local Aboriginal people, Gagaju mostly, but from around the territory. And one of the last nights that we were there, we saw a couple of meteors shoot by, a couple of shooting stars go by. And I didn't say anything because I had done my research before I went, and I knew, at least at the basic level, what that meant. And one of the tour guides said that means that somebody's passed away. So, a couple of minutes of fairly silent time, and we went back to doing the normal thing again. And then the next day was our last day there, and we were supposed to have a little bit of an in-class wrap up for the week before we took off. And we were waiting, and nobody ever came. We were actually starting to get a little bit annoyed, like, well, we've got to take off soon, and nobody's here. What's going on? I went over to the manager's office and said, hey, nobody's here. What's going on? He says, oh, yeah, everybody's off at SARD business. 2 elders passed away last night. So that was That was quite the experience.
What about on Mare? What did you learn about meteors or shooting stars and the way that is observed and held in cultural practice on Mare?
Similar kind of thing. It means somebody's either passed away or is about to pass away, and their spirit is taken to the top of the tallest tree, set alight, and it's kind of like a rocket that fires off to the island of the dead, and all the different properties of that shooting star, that Maya, that bright shooting star. It has to be a bright one, not a faint one, a bright one, like a fireball. It tells you different things about that person and the situation. And they talk about a lot of different properties of the Maya that, Western science thought that it only knew about. And what was really fantastic is a couple of years after I had learned about this, and the elders had told me the stories, and there's songs and dances tied to that, I was contacted by a filmmaker who was working for Werner Herzog, and they were wanting to do a documentary called Fireball about meteorites and meteors in cultures around the world. And they wanted me to help them, be a consultant on that. So I said, well, we had decided on Gundamala, Wolf Creek Crater in Jaru country. And I said, well, the other one we should do in the Torres Strait. It should be on the Maya. So I contacted the community and the elders up there and told them what the film was about to see if they were okay with that. And yeah, they were happy with that. And we got up there with the film crew. And the problem is the elders have been saying, and part of the impetus as to why we're doing this work, they say that the knowledge is slowly evaporating over the generations. People leave the island to go to school. They don't come back often. Or if they do, it's just for a short time for a visit. But there's not a lot of economic opportunities. Some people, they move to the mainland or wherever, they get families and stuff. And therefore, they leave the island usually at year 7 level, most of the younger generation. And they're not learning the higher levels of knowledge about the language and the traditions and everything. So the elders wanted to record, and they said, well, this Maya dance, it hasn't been performed in a long time. It's from Mare, but it hadn't been performed on the island in 50 years. 1969 was the last time they had done that. And none of the dancers knew it. So what we did is they got 4 local dancers, and we went down because you had to do the dance at dusk. We went down to the beach at sunset, and there's 2 movements to the dance. We only recorded 1 movement. But Uncle Alo Tapim, who's one of the elders on that, he taught the dancers how to do that dance on film just a few hours before. So they filmed that, and it was really remarkable because not only was it the first time that dance had been performed in 50 years, but that scene concludes the documentary. And what you see in the film is that the 4 dancers actually learning that. You can even see a little bit. They're a little bit hesitant when they're doing the dance because they just learned it a couple of hours before. But it was a really beautiful experience, and Uncle Alo speaks on that. And it was a great way for the world to see the richness and depth of these traditions.
What was the atmosphere like in that community or among those dancers after that performance, redoing that dance for the first time in so long? What was it like?
It's hard for me to say. I mean, I was there, but I can't speak on behalf of the community. I do know it was, funnily enough, there were kind of mixed feelings. They were happy that it was finally, it was being recorded and potentially millions of people were going to see it. But they were getting annoyed at having to play the song over and over and over again for the cameras. They eventually said, "This is the last time. We're not here to keep doing this. Like, you film it, we're going to do it." But they had their boundaries and limits, and they weren't just going to be told by some film director to do it for the 10th time in a row. They're like, "This kind of feels like you're taking the piss. We'll do one more. And that's all you get. Make sure you get good cameras on, good footage of that." So, but no, it was really great.
What is happening with the proceeds of the book of the First Astronomers?
All of the author royalties, the money that would normally go to me, all of the royalties from book sales in Australia go to a charity we set up that goes to scholarships and community programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and people and communities. All royalties from book sales in Aotearoa, New Zealand, go to the SMART group. This is the Society for Maori Astronomy Research and Traditions. This is chaired by Dr. Pauline Harris, a Maori astrophysicist. I believe, the first PhD qualified Maori astrophysicist. And all other international book sales, those royalties are going to be going to native sky watchers. This is an education, not-for-profit program set up by Dr. Annette Lee, a Lakota astrophysicist.
You were on Mayor when the State College got a new telescope. How much kind of general interest was there in the community about having this telescope?
Well, I brought it, so it was a lot of fun. They really enjoyed that experience because there was a couple of reasons for it. So we decided to get the telescope out, and each night a different year group would come and we would do something by the school, look up at the stars and planets, whatever happened to be there. It was really great because the students were getting to see through a telescope for the first time, a lot of them. And even some of the elders were seeing things for the very first time. And the reactions of some of the elders when they saw the rings of Saturn was pretty astounding. So that was really great. But I also noticed that the reaction of the community to me was a bit different. And when I first started going up the first few years, it was positive, but, I was a new person. I was this American guy there doing stuff. And even though the elders were happy to share knowledge, they were still a little bit hesitant in some ways. And I wasn't exactly a top priority by any means. And when I brought the telescope up, that completely changed. All of a sudden, the elders were calling me constantly, wanting to come up and have a conversation and chat, as opposed to me talking and trying to call the elders to arrange something. And then they cancel because they're busy. All of a sudden, it became kind of a priority, a bit of a hot thing that was happening. It was morning to midnight every single day. I was like, what's going on? And I remember sitting with Uncle Allo, Tapim, and asking him. And he says, well, Duane, you've been coming to the island for a number of years, and we've been happy to share stuff with you, and that's been fine. But it's also been a little bit difficult for us to know what we're getting out of all of this. Like, we know you're going to make a book and there's some papers being published and stuff, but until now, we haven't seen anything tangible. Like, it's been nice, but we're really wanting more. And with the telescope, we see how the kids interact with that. We see something tangible. And now that we have that changes things. So it was a learning experience for me too, and learning that, the community's getting their names on an academic paper, that's nice, but, okay, what else? I want to see something directly with the students that was going to last more than my visit. And the telescope was one of those things that they were really happy about.
Thank you so much, Duane, for sharing some of what you've learnt on Conversations.
Well, thank you for having me on.
For more episodes, hit subscribe or grab the ABC Listen app and listen to this show and many others all ad-free.